Award recipient, Vivian Beer. You know, at Cranbrook, it's important that we highlight our accomplishments of our alums as they go on to change the world, and as you know, many of them do. The Alumni Achievement Award recognizes great accomplishments of our grads early in their career, and their recognition also confirms the Academy's pride in the alumni and our desire to highlight their accomplishments. Come on, take a seat, you guys. It's important to know, Vivian, we will announce this award not only to the Cranbrook educational community, our alums, and so forth, but also to the local and national press. And just to give you a little bit of process here about how this actually comes together, Evie Wheat, who's sitting right down here in front, chair of the Alumni Circle Committee, proposes a candidate from the Alumni Circle to me at the beginning of each calendar year, and as a small group, we come up with a few nominees, and then I make the final decision. But you need to know that you are chosen from a long list of important alumni currently working at the moment. And I should also point out the Alumni Circle is a committee of the Cranbrook Academy of Art Board of Governors and is made up and includes the alumni, some alumni, the governors, administrators, and friends of the Academy as part of its members. So it's a cross-section of all stakeholders here at in the community. So with that said, I mean, true to the Academy's cross-departmental nature, this year's recipient, Vivian, graduated from Metals in 2004, but has gone on to start her own very successful career in contemporary furniture design. She owns her own business called Vivian Beer Studio Works, which is located in New England, where she likes to say she recontextualizes what furniture can represent and how we interact and how it interacts with our domestic landscape. Vivian describes her recent works as luxurious deployment of the senses, and I know that many of us agree with that sentiment completely when we see your work. The material, as you're going to see as she talks about her work this evening, the material, color, and aerodynamic shapes used in her design really evoke an amazing curiosity. We often know if we should sit on these pieces, what they're actually going to do to us when we look at them, but they're really fabulous, fabulous works. And it's the kind of work that we love to celebrate here at the Academy as it pushes the boundaries of both design and the object itself. Vivian's work is in the prominent collections, in many prominent collections, including, I should say, the Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian of the Art Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Museum of Art and Design in New York, and the Brooklyn Museum of Art, just to name a few. She has been awarded an impressive number of residencies, including the 2014 Artist Research Fellowship at the Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian. I'd like to hear more about that for sure. And most recently, the Wingate Artist Residency at the University of Wisconsin. So it gives me great pleasure to announce Vivian Beer as the recipient of Cranbrook Academy of Arts 2016 Alumni Achievement Award. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite Alan Rothfair, the chair of the board, and Evie Weed up to the podium, and Vivian, because we're going to give her a new certificate for her achievement. So please come on up. So without further ado, Vivian Beer.
There we go. That's right. Thank you so much. It's hard to have words knowing how much talent comes out of Cranbrook every single year, and how much talent in the last, say, what has it been, 12 years, guys? We've got some. So it's kind of amazing to come and speak to you really at this point. I was having a conversation with my wife, and she was saying, how long have you been in business? And I'm like, well, 10 years. Okay, maybe we can do this, right? I guess as a business owner, I feel like there's a mark there of that I am just starting to feel like maybe this is what I get to do for a living. 10 years, nice. But really, I want to talk to you about what I'm interested in. I feel like I make with two hearts. On one hand, I grew up in rural Maine, just half feral on the coast. And we didn't really grow up with television or any of those newfangled kind of things. So I got most of my entertainment really from the natural environment around me. And I feel like those forces of nature that you find, and I know a lot of people say they're inspired by nature. I don't want to just join the crowd, but I'm going to join the crowd and say I'm very inspired by nature. But what I'm inspired about is the forces. There's really a kind of truth of design that you can find in the way things that freeze and thaw, the way a shadow casts across something. On the other hand, I'm a part of this other culture of just this superhighway of information, glitter, glamour, information, speed, and that kind of power is just a part of our lives. It affects us one way or another. So those forces of culture that are surrounding us and those forces of nature that I feel like I grew up with no choice but finding them the most entertaining thing, mingle together in my perspective of the world and certainly my perspective as a designer. What I do with those is a classic sense of abstraction. My background prior to coming to Cranbrook for the metals program was in sculpture. And I really love that concept of abstraction because it's not just nothing, it's everything. It's taking more than one thing or a combination of things and packing it into a form that's able to speak in a way that I think even words can't. It's the visual language. So what I take with these abstractions, and certainly as I was starting out, this is the work that I was doing here, is taking those abstractions and drawing and turning it into furniture. So that you were really kind of caught in a drawing in these earlier works. And do you recognize it? Yeah? So I was really thinking of calligraphy and form and the ways those could speak. So out of that, there's a really important relationship to material to talk about too. I did study sculpture, but then I went on to spend a couple of years working as that's right, wood wins sometimes. I spent a couple of years working as an architectural iron. So I had this perspective coming into school about metal being a very soft and ductile material. And I don't do any forging anymore, but that perspective of it being kind of a very mutable material and the intimacy of working it in that way is very much a part of the way I think of it now. So I was working, I studied sculpture, and I was working as a blacksmith, and I thought, I don't want to be a blacksmith. And that was kind of the moment at which I just decided to apply to graduate school. And one of the reasons for that is that I felt like I didn't have the kind of design voice that I wanted to in architectural iron. So moving forward, I'm just going to talk while you guys see how I make things a lot tonight, just because we love to make things. I know we're all in the same boat here. So I started taking some of those techniques and the ductility of the material, heating it up, and making designs that were maybe going to kind of erase that kind of historical mark of the hammer. But I very much started to realize when I was here and when I was working with Gary of how much the decorative arts was a part of my feeling of design, and that sort of the kind of curves that we're able to speak. So that's the decorative arts is one of those cultures that I feel like I link into, and one of those forces of culture I link into really in pretty much every piece that I do. And in a funny way, I felt like it gave me a perspective of knowing of that it was a field. Before I had come here, I never really realized that decorative arts was a field of study. I was just making decorative arts. So sometimes I think it helps to be able to put some perspective to it. So this is some of the work that I was doing at the time, bringing those kind of ideas of the material into what I would think of as contemporary design, clean line design. I have done quite a few residencies. One of the longest of those was at Penland School of Craft, and that's really where I headed after graduate school. It's a residency that was actually designed by a guy that came from Cranbrook, and with the idea that, wow, it just wasn't long enough, but I don't want anybody lecturing me anymore. So Bill Brown started this residency at Penland School of Craft where you have 3 years and an empty space to do with what you will. And it was a really special time because I got a chance with some degree of support to build up a shop and really force the start of my business with these pieces. And it gave me a lot of time to unpack the ideas that I had here. Of furniture and of using these kind of industrial materials and these elegant curves. But one of the things that really knocked me sideways for 5 years into a really great world was this kind of accident where I bought a can of automotive paint. I had gotten this very small grant and of course was living on almost nothing as far as buying materials at that time. But I wanted to make a piece out of bronze so I could move. It was kind of a practical thing. I wanted to be able to do outdoor work, right? And people have only so much room for furniture in their house. I thought, well, let's go for the garden. And so I thought I got to make it out of bronze because, you know, you just don't paint things, right? But I couldn't really afford bronze even with the grant. So I thought, well, this will do. I'll get a metallic that has bronze in it, and a lot of the metallic paints actually have metallic material in there. This one was a 1980s Mazda color that it really reminded me of my bike when I was a kid. And I got it because it was bronze, and then I realized I actually got it because it reminded me of my bike when I was a kid. It reminded me of the 80s, and it reminded me of all these things. And kind of falling in by chance into the automotive paints, it kind of brought me to, I was no longer using the color wheel so much as I was using this kind of culturally agreed upon and branded color wheel, right? So that's Alexis White that you've probably seen rolling around at some point. And really falling in love with what these paints could do optically and how seductive they could make a surface that was in essence very rough and industrial with this larger material, right? I mean, you look at a pearlescent and things change somewhere deep inside your brain. You need to reach out and touch. So that sort of promise and allure of really hot rods and high-end auto became part of the language that I was using to draw people into the experiences that I was making with the furniture. Don't forget about the abstraction, right? So in a lot of ways, I feel like everything I do leads from and to many different things. So a trip to the aquarium can equal a whole body of work. But one thing that also happened, and I think of this a lot now more intentionally, is anytime I start to pursue a certain technique, I fall into this whole culture of making and really culture around, in this case, cars. So not only was I really getting into the paints and what those could mean, but I was getting into the different construction techniques and the different types of allure that say different times of vehicle and the kind of Americana and everything that could happen. So I started making my pieces like a coach builder would, or like somebody knocking out a fender for a hot rod would. And that just left all those flat lines behind. So everything started to become this very curvaceous surface. So that was building a couple of different things. On one hand, you're adding to that allure, you're highlighting the optics of the paint, and you're also making compound curved surfaces that, in my mind, really really have a lot of empathy with our own bodies, but also a lot of empathy with comfort. So there's a lot of different things that these paints do to bring you in. This one, of course, shifts in between blue and green in a natural light setting where it does live right now. To draw you in, but there's a couple of different things that are happening. I feel like I was talking about this with a number of different, this is just building it, but I'm going to talk about the ideas behind it. Talking about in some of the meetings that I've had with students over the last couple days is that you can make all these promises visually, especially with a functional piece, and all these promises of pleasure and beauty and all these things to suck somebody in. And then you got to make sure that there's payoff on that, and especially when it's something like a chair where you're not only going to be feeling it physically by sitting on it, but you're also going to be running your hands over it and all these things. So you can see me working the edge and working the form. And in a lot of ways, one of the things I feel about craftsmanship is the level of craftsmanship or the type of craft that you're pursuing with an individual piece is so much about making that piece fulfill its promises. It's like, cashing the checks, So you don't want to, your eyes lock from across the room, right? And then you get up close to somebody, you're like, whew, that's not what I thought I was getting into. Like, that's not the experience you want to be building here. So there has to be a sort of kind of fulfillment to that promise. And in the case of these pieces, that fulfillment is this very kind of luxurious curve with absolutely no bumps or lumps where they shouldn't be. These are the anchored candy pieces, and one of kind of the idea behind this came from this moment where I thought to myself, I think cosmetics and hot rods have a lot in common. And then, you got to ask yourself, well, what exactly do they have in common? And to me, there's a couple of different things going on. Actually, one of my assistants had said, what is that midlife crisis that they have in common? And, I think it's like a much deeper thing than that. And that they have all of that promise. In the case of a muscle car, you have the promise of this sort of really hardcore masculine, rumbly power. And in the case of the cosmetics, of beautifying yourself in kind of more classically feminine traits. But what they directly have in common is that not only are they beautiful in and of themselves, but they have a physical interaction with you that is physically pleasurable. So in the case of an old car, a lot of those engines, they're shaking, they're rumbling you right inside your chest, right? So you feel really powerful. So you've seen this powerful thing, you feel this powerful thing, and that makes you feel powerful. The same, say you're applying lipstick, you have this very pleasurable experience. It's beautiful itself, and you feel more beautiful on, kind of a visual and a physical level. And that's really what I'm trying to do with this furniture. So it's mixing into it some of these really complications of fashion, and, hopefully a little bit of humor. They are very much the high heels of the furniture world, I feel like. So there is a kind of dedication to the preposterous, and in a lot of the works. This is just saying it can happen for men too. It's a great piece a Brazilian graduate student did recently. But there's something, the higher the heels, closer to God, right? The longer the shoes, not so sure. But there's something happening with scale with these objects that can add a lot to I think a piece of fashion in this case. Yeah, those are real. So we have these fashion choices, and I feel like, why can't we make extreme furniture choices as well? There's a lot of things we can do, blowing things out of proportion emotionally. I like something a little bit more classic. But anyway, so there is oh no! You close your eyes. Ready? Oh, no. So there is, close your eyes. Think about your favorite pair of shoes, just for a second. And what it feels like to put them on. I got it from current slide. There you go. Okay, so remember, we were laughing. I had you, right? I was drawing you in. Come back, come back. So with the Anchor Candy series, I'm trying to do that, but I'm trying to do it with furniture. And it's funny because they do become almost this, watching people use them or decidedly not use them in front of other people, it becomes almost a personality test. That's how many of me, I've been cloning for a number of years. That's how you get this much done. But no, I do primarily work on my own, kind of in a classic design build or sculpture studio format. We'll talk about that a bit later. But anyway, imagining yourself in this when you encounter this piece, and then also kind of having that performative experience when you're on it. So some people, when they come up to these, they might instantly feel like Betty Page, and they sit on that chair like they're Betty Page. And I've definitely had people come studio visit that wouldn't even go near them. So that kind of psychological experience that they can set up with that promise and fulfillment and desirability is pretty interesting to see play out. This is kind of another body of work that happened. So I was making these kind of measurement tools, what would be called a buck, which doesn't make sense to anybody who hasn't done auto body stuff. But they're usually made out of plywood, but I would be making them out of metal because I don't really have that much woodworking capability in my studio. So I was doing a residency, and it was an unusual situation, and I feel like the residencies and travel have really framed my practice, especially in relationship to change and innovation. So I was doing a residency at SUNY Purchase, and I was making one of these for a piece, and somebody said, "Wow, that's a really great piece, man." And it was like getting complimented on your tape measure for me. I'm just like, but that's what you throw away. It doesn't even matter. But I thought about it. This is Purchase's campus, and I was in this really repetitive space, and I'd been thinking about this body of work, and a lot of times I'll do an entire series and I'll actually have some language and thoughts around it of what's going to go into it far before it actually takes form. And in this case, this one's called infrastructure, which is funny, right, guys? You've been talking about infrastructure all, all week with me. And it was gonna have something to do with the fact that when I look into a vaulted ceiling like this, I get the same feeling as when I look at overpasses. That there's something about that strong concrete infrastructure and what it does for us as a society, and the kind of quality of the material that has this unusual reaction for me. So I wanted to do something that was so much easier than metal, and I thought concrete would be the one. So I started making these as both the kind of the decoration and the strength of the piece is in these wire, or they're not wire, they're thicker metal frameworks. And then kind of very much like stucco, the concrete is applied, and then with lots of grinding, the surface gets reworked back down to the metal. And what that does is it creates this form that has a lot of voluptuousness and a lot of quality to the surface because it's been worked so much, but it also reveals this structure. And there's one thing just that I think of with all of my work is making that decorative part of the piece also the structural part of the piece. So in a lot of ways, when I'm choosing these lines, I'm not choosing them in a lot of ways purposely working away from pure geometries just enough to give them some personality. One thing I think I was talking about with Descrit in 3D is I have this feeling that we might look back and be able to identify the kind of computer programs we're using, and I want to make sure that that's not going to happen with my work. This is one of my favorite pictures ever. It's a representation of how the structure works in the Forth Bridge in Edinburgh, Scotland. And I feel like it really exemplifies the idea for me of the infrastructure series, is that it's very much about architecture, but it's also very much about relationships. So with all of these, for the most part, they're benches in this series, but this one I feel like speaks in most directly to that idea. I wanted to make something that was a conversation chair, and there have been many conversation chairs. But what bothers me is most of the time they have a barrier in between the two people. So it's like, be close, I want you to talk, but not too close, right? And I thought, no, let's get closer, let's cuddle. So I was trying to think of what kind of functionality or space would be able to create that kind of conversation. And I was thinking very much of how a hammock can create that, especially if you're face-to-face, legs in one direction. So that's the same way that this is built. It's about 8 feet long, so that your feet, it's 4 foot wide. There's a lot of room, so you can have a conversation, but not... it got installed somewhere where there's a lot of chickens. So I'm not sure how it's going, but you can kind of get a sense of how it lives in the environment and how it can become kind of this great conversation area. And when people would use it, it actually created conversation quite a bit. So another trip, and you can see how angry I am. I had to drive across country very quickly for another residency out at San Diego State University. And I was spending an entire semester there, and I used that time, sometimes I go to experience a place, and sometimes I go with an objective. In this case, I was going to spend that 6 months making myself really hone my CAD skills. Because I was starting to use it on the larger projects, but it was time to make sure that I knew what I was doing. So I made sure to do all of my designs were done in this kind of digital landscape at the time, but also trying to hone, in this case, the jigs and fixtures that were going to be with each piece. And that's, in a lot of ways, I use a combination of digital design and also the hand skills. So in this case, you have the digitally designed buck, right? Remember what a buck was? Or jig. That's not only used to measure the bends, which are all done by hand on a hydraulic press, into super compound curves that wouldn't make sense for a pipe bender, essentially. It would take so long to program that you could never do it. So there needs to be some hand in there, but there also needs to be this level of accuracy that you can get with the jig. I mean, talk about a great tape measure, right? So this is kind of one of the approaches. It's developed from that. But this other thing that happened that's actually led to some of the other projects, the kind of larger projects that I was doing later, is this falling in love with a place. And when I was headed out there from the Northeast, I work in New Hampshire, everybody said, well, you're just going to spend all your time at the beach. And really, I spent all my time at the desert. And I really fell in love with the desert. And I think what it is for me is that those forces of nature are laid bare in such a more extreme way than they are in the Northeast. And it was my first time being out west, so everything hit me harder than it might have if I had grown up there. And so I've been continually searching to try to capture some of that wildness of that landscape and bring it back into the domestic landscape. So I started doing this project very directly, taking urethane casts of limestone and different cracked mud textures and working those into benches and also pairing them with different photography approaches. Another project, we've been talking a lot about pattern. I feel like you guys are with me on so many things over the past few days. The conversation have been really great. Is that I've been doing these digitally designed patterns off of a number of different things. In this case, Edgar Braunt's screen, who's definitely my favorite blacksmith, hands down. One of the things I love about his work is I feel like it has a strong nod both to nature and the mechanical in the decorative moves he's making. So the hammer marks are creating this almost cog or gear-like thing as much as they are a fern, which is very much an indicator of that style, that kind of time in that style. So This is a gear pattern that's a random pattern that I took really off of that kind of idea of the fern in his piece, routed in aluminum into the face of these assemblable parts, rolled, boom, boom, and then painted to get those patterns to really shimmer. Another work I've been doing is actually this little chair right here, just finishing this one, which is really exciting, is using this perforated repeat pattern that's actually pulled off of trash. So I found this on the street and I thought, wow, it's such a strong symbol, especially, remembering into the 90s when we're really working hard to keep from killing all of the sea animals with these. So that it's not only a really great piece of packaging in a way, but it's also this really strong, I think, cultural symbol. So I took that and turned it into a repeat pattern, manipulated it, and plasma cut it. Figured you guys would want some technique info. And bent it into a chair because that's what you do, right? With trash, you turn it into gold. So I'm going to talk about some really specific projects. And it's, again, thinking about that kind of the span of time that's happened since I graduated from here, the second half of that has really been distinguished by being far more outward looking than kind of inward studio practice. And I named my company Studio Works many years ago, really for no particular reason. I think we don't always plan out our decisions. But the way I've come to think of it now is that I have a studio where things happen, and then I have works that could happen anywhere. So there's this, I think a lot about the relationship between public and private and kind of the spectrum of performance and intimacy in furniture, but also in my practice in general. So I started doing quite a bit of public art really in the second half of my career, and it's kind of dominating the way I think about my work these days. And it's a real struggle as somebody that's an object maker. I'm really coming from an object maker point of view where I'm trying to take all this information and pack it into an individual object, which is quite different than making a marker of space or interacting with a community, which is really the most important part in a public art. So I'm trying to kind of jam both of those point of views into my public art practice. So say Cloud Couch that's in the front there, I'm really trying to think of how people interact with that. And in a lot of ways, when I'm making furniture, I'm not thinking of it in terms of comfort or ergonomics precisely. I'm thinking of it as an experience, as a stage for interaction, really kind of like a stage set for interaction. So in this case, that Cloud Couch on the right is actually mounted, the sit is very high. So for me, if I sit on just about any chair, my feet dangle a little bit, right? But for most people, you can put your feet on the ground. So I wanted to give people that dangly feel because it makes you feel like you're floating on a cloud, and it makes you instantly have a slightly more playful interaction with the world around you because your feet are swinging, and it reminds you of being a kid. This is another one in Cambridge, and I'm putting this one in mostly for tech, as far as that idea of the interaction between hand skills and digital design and production. So this one was designed completely digitally. Everything's flattened out, everything's water jet cut, but then everything's bent with a 3-point die and the hydraulic press. It's 3/8 by 3-inch stainless, and actually one of the most popular skateboarder places really in all of greater Boston right now. That's what happens with curves. Go Sox. Anyway, so this is, so there's quite a bit of handwork in there, but really the digital is making that possible, and especially via really what ends up being, the art piece is almost the jigs in a lot of ways for these pieces that can gain for accuracy. So this one, it's actually built on a curve with 1-inch distance in between all of those undulating curves, which would be, I would say, impossible to do by hand without that level of the digital design behind it. So back to the desert. Another really outward-looking project that I've done in the past 5 years was called Desert Design Lab, and it was supported by the John D. Minnick Furniture Fellowship, which is one to keep in mind for the furniture makers. It was specific to Boston area furniture makers, but has gone national at this point. And it's a project grant, so pretty much you propose something and they say that sounds like a great idea or not. And I was really surprised when they said they thought this was a great idea. My idea was to take an RV and go all the way across the country and spend 2 months in the desert, continuing that work that I started in San Diego State, but also inviting other furniture makers out to collaborate and exchange ideas. And a lot of it was about play and was about adventure and was about that collaboration, that sort of searching for risk and curiosity in a studio. In this, what could a studio look like? Really is kind of the question. And we did do graphics and everything, so strangers, as much as I was inviting people out, also strangers could come up and say, "What are you doing?" Which is, I would say, the polar opposite of what it's like to work alone in a studio. So we had a lot of different stuff. Are you guys okay? I'm hearing a little shifting. I know it's dinner time. You're with me? Yeah? We're good? We're in the desert? Yes. And we're warm. Desert Design Lab, although we went in the winter so that we could actually work in the desert. And spent time in California, quite a bit of time in Nevada and Moab, all over the place. So took quite a few molds, hit a lot of snow, saw some really amazing things. So much of it is about the road trip as much as being out there. So the Western desert has this amazing history, not only within the nature, but I found when I was out there, but the interaction with us and nature. So the tracks that we leave in the desert last far longer in a lot of ways than anywhere else because hey, it never rains, nothing grows, it can't be covered in vines. So not only is the geology and those forces of nature laid bare, but also those forces of culture are laid bare and I think become more poignant than certainly they feel in a climate where we have trees. And also, yes, the history of nuclear testing and all that is pretty intense. I've just got it. I should go back one because so there was all of this really amazing culture that kind of goes along with this texture. But still, I'm stealing texture. I'm stealing little parts of what is a very compelling atmosphere and bringing it back to the studio. One iteration of that was this cast concrete. Of course, because I can't get enough concrete, I thought let's mix some more and pour it again. So this is a version of the concrete bench off of that urethane mold, which didn't feel like enough of a change, really, from what the desert floor was really like anyway. So I thought I'd give it a go again, and this is actually the project that I did in the Wingate in Madison. I spent a month there, and they were kind enough to give me access to their casting facility. So I actually took that texture and turned it into a 3D object that we could use for a sand mold. And I'm telling you that the rubber desert on its own is its own kind of amazing thing to roll around the studio. It's like this giant skin. And it really takes on so many different connotations when you take it off the ground. But this is some of the process of, it was a 300-pound pour, quite a bit of work. Sand molds are brutally tiring in small footsteps because that is an absolutely full crucible that's going to go into a single mold. But I was really trying to find a way to translate the material into something, not only translate it with the material and the form out of the desert, but still capture some of that cracked, visceral nature of it. So here's some of the bronze raw going together, and here's it finished. And I think one of the interesting things, and this is where working with these landscapes, I feel like, give me a lot of information, is that the interconnection between things becomes so obvious. So say if you laid underneath this bench, which I called suspended landscape, it felt like being underwater, that the ripples of that dried, cracked desert actually became like water on the other side of the mold. So there's something very poignant about that, and I'm doing a number of these actually about the tracks in the desert right now. So there's this kind of truth to texture that I think, again, can kind of pull into design, especially in combination with an unusual use of materials. And really, I feel like what I'm trying to do with this pattern work and this is kind of point out those interconnections between things that we don't normally think of. And the collaborative component of it is that they can show me things that I just can't find on my own. That if you're thinking about taking an impression, I think so much of my impression of being out there was seeing what other people saw, because we all kind of have a different pattern that we're looking for, and a different pattern that we find in things. So what can it mean to pull a pattern, and how can you use that? And especially translating it from something that is wild into something that's, say, tamed in our own environments. Another huge part of that for me was indulging myself in photography. I've actually always spent a lot of time photographing everything. It's kind of my secret. If I have a cabinet of curiosities, this is it, is photographing all of these different kind of modes of nature and culture and gathering them together. But in this case, trying to point out the things that I was finding out there, and then actually printing them. I've been printing them directly onto aluminum with UV printers, and then, which is very durable. But the really interesting thing is actually leaving out the white. So instead of white, you have the shimmer of the aluminum, and the shimmer of the aluminum not only darkens the image, but it gives it this really crazy depth, which I also increased by putting a clear coat on top of that. So for durability, and also to really make the images pop in a way that would match the kind of eerie personality of the desert itself. One of my favorite places to be out there, and one of my favorite collaborations, so I'm just gonna go into one of them. You guys are with me, right? We're in the Bonneville Salt Flats now. Has anybody ever been there? No? Yes? Right? Right. Phenomenal. And we're very lucky in that it had rained, which is a very unusual thing to happen. And when it does rain, if you Google this, you'll go find a lot of people walking on water like Jesus out there, right? Because when it rains about 3 inches for 100 miles, right? Because it's such a flat place that you can see the curvature of the earth at night. You can see people actually driving around it. So it's this kind of magical place, and we ended up making some pieces directly in the landscape. And I think one of the other interesting things about doing this collaborative experience is it was really permission to step so far outside of your own artistic vocabulary, because there's actually a number of people working on each piece, and you were also so out of your comfort zone in a place that you'd never been in before. And Jen Anderson, who's another furniture maker, was out there, and it was I think one of the reasons that it was such a special collaboration for me is she's actually from Nevada, and she's a part of a family that would be termed downwinders, because they grew up watching the nuclear tests like they were fireworks at their farm. And they were downwind from all of that fallout. And there's a lot of health fallout from that kind of in Nevada in general, but also in her family. So there's a lot of really strong feelings about the landscape within her, and I felt in a lot of ways we were making these pieces really for her. So in this case, this is a salt girl. We actually gathered up the floating salt and into this figure, which had a very cathartic relationship for her. And we also, this is door A that we put together, headed out there talking. So we would get out there and just be like, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? What are we gonna talk about? And Jen does a lot of work with cracked mud, too. So we took this door that we found and covered it with mud and made this photograph that was also, I think in a lot of ways, telling a story about that place. But if you really want to know more, I feel like we just went internet on you, right? Yeah. Okay. Tumblr. There's a Tumblr page. So another thing that came of that is I started doing this streamliner work. And this is one of the land yachts that I saw when I was out there, which is great. And I was really thinking differently about storage and holding things, and it made me want to make my first case piece. I've never made cabinetry before, so I made this out of that, which I called Zephyr, and have kind of been going down this 1930s hole of streamlined trains right now. So it's all planes, trains, and automobiles for me. I love the designed objects of momentum and what they feel like, and how we, especially in the 1930s, we were designing objects that felt fast, but a lot of the cars, the actually aerodynamic cars were so ugly nobody would buy them. So they would design these cars that weren't aerodynamic but looked like they might be at the time. And so much of that was this love of flight that was happening. So I took that idea and that work I was making and applied to the Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship that you guys had mentioned, and it's a really interesting fellowship because you're there just to get inspired. That's literally your job, and I'm thinking that's the best job ever. I can do this, right? But you have access to anything in the Smithsonian, but you have to decide what you're going to be studying and find somebody who's going to guide you to that. So a number of people were working with fish or like all kinds of different things. But I was at the Air and Space Museum and I was studying not only flight, but the imagery and ideas around flight, really as my entrance point, 1930s streamline design. And I think what I did is I fell in love with engineering while I was there. I felt like as I was spending the time, and it was 2 months straight, so it was a significant period of time with the collection and with the people working there, is that I found, not only were there the things, the kind of loaded nostalgia and things that were falling apart and the history of kind of aerodynamics and how we're going faster and faster and faster and faster. The development of airplanes at the end of World War II, for instance, is fascinating. It was like the Germans already had jet engines. I didn't know that, but they did. So this kind of violence based around air travel development, but also this sort of exuberance that people had for it, all kind of from the golden age of flight into what we're doing today. So really, I fell in love with this structure. And interestingly enough, I feel like all of this is going to be really what the next body of work is all about, is this sort of de-skinning of the pieces. So all the different approaches to structure really, really changed me. You're like, what is that, right? Whenever I start getting comfortable, I just do something completely different. Have you guys noticed that yet? Right. No, this is not my piece. No, this is a chest on chest by the Dunlap brothers, who are these New Hampshire Scottish furniture designers. And one of the things I wanted to point out from the time at Air and Space, which was really about 1.5 years ago, is that I realized for the first time, and it seems I'm kind of ashamed of it now, is that I realized that museums are a resource for artists. I know that seems awful, right? That they're actually research institutions, so that it wouldn't be just that you're going to go there and spend some time walking around, but that you can work with curators. And if you know how to ask really nicely, you can work with objects. So I had this idea. I'd been talking about the Currier Museum, which is local to me in Manchester, about doing a piece. And I was like, well, why don't I do a piece working with your collection? And they said, well, sure, that sounds great. So I narrowed it down to, they have a really great kind of turn-of-the-century woodworking furniture collection. So basically a bunch of stuff that looks like this. But they also have a really great New Hampshire collection. And so I kind of narrowed it down. Well, I'm going to make it about furniture. I'm going to make it about New Hampshire furniture. And I'm going to make it about this piece. And what I really fell in love with about this piece was this little foot right here. So I know, obviously, I've got a foot thing going on. But feet are historically a really interesting part of furniture, and certainly chairs, but chests as well. So thinking about the kind of symbolic nature of the changing feet over time. But I thought, well, I'm going to do something different with it. It's probably going to have something to do with this. And so I took that foot and brought it into the computer and started working with it, thinking through different ideas, sketching, and then modeling. And I do quite a bit of modeling, especially with these compound curve pieces. And what I'll do is I'll model in scale and 3D scan it, and then bring it into the computer, break it apart, and then I'll actually be able to manipulate it. And usually when it's at this point, I'll cut it up and do full-scale, blow it up and do full-scale models, route it out, so that I can kind of move back and forth between the real world and the digital world, adjusting the scale, both for visual things, but especially, in this case, for the sit. So I know I was saying that, comfort isn't always the biggest concern, but it's often terribly important. And especially in something like this, there's actually a chaise, which is one of the hardest kind of sits to create. And I wanted this to be incredibly comfortable so that it could counterbalance how kind of wild it is. So it has this tie to kind of the turn-of-the-century foot, but also to this kind of modern car culture, to the fashion, and also when you sit on it, you feel like a queen. So this is how rough those full-scale models are. You know what it is? It's about speed at that point. And in a lot of ways, I wanted to talk just for a second of, I am a designer maker, and that's very important to me. I not only design, but I make the pieces. And it has this really closed loop in between not only having a high understanding of the craftsmanship and the material, but also feeling very comfortable making my own manufacturing processes. So in this case, I'm making a new hydraulic press and some new tooling for a larger piece later, so that it's not just designing the piece, it's designing the way the piece will be made. So I do make quite a bit of, especially different dies, to make these kind of shapes, which is extremely difficult. Using, for the most part, 1/8" steel on these pieces, it makes them incredibly durable and really able to take the beating, again, thinking of this in a really public art kind of location. So here's some of the substructure. Now remember all the airplane wings, right? Yeah, everything changed. So in a lot of ways, the structure of this piece is really based as on an airplane wings design. So it has a central spar, so I'm able to get this, support quite a bit of weight that way, and put together. So in a lot of ways, I started stretching skin over the different metal substructures, and it gives me a chance to make things that are incredibly strong, but also they're working almost as a measurement tool as well, so that I can assess what are very complicated curves over the life of a piece. I really do feel like the next step is going to be taking all of that off. So you can see it takes a little while to put one of these guys together. And then, a very important part, bringing back the idea of color. This one ended up candy apple red, which is a really classic hot rod color, and brings it, I think, even further into a dialogue of Americana, and more recent car culture, as well as the turn of the century piece. So this is the last project, I swear. You guys still with me? Yeah? Yeah? I'm losing my voice. That was a lot of desk crit, guys. A lot. So this is the bigger project I'm working on right now. It's another public art piece that's actually for the city of Arlington. That's going to go in July of this year. And not this is inspiration. Yeah, sorry. No, this is actually a trophy that I found that was given in a race during the golden age of flight. And one of the things I loved while I was spending the time studying airplanes was the entire culture around them, and how when it first came out, it was just like, the whole world is going to be amazing and wonderful. And then we started dropping bombs out of them, and everybody was like, this is going to be terrible, right? So all of this stuff has happened around our relationships to flight. But really, at first, it had this very hopeful kind of feeling, this really utopian kind of feeling to it. And I think one of the reasons I love that period of time and that streamlined design is that it feels so similar to what's going on today, of sort of this digital revolution, and we feel like everything's going to change, and it's kind of this hope in counterbalance to the madness that's happening. And I think it seems like a very similar cultural time. But a lot of that hope found its way into, not only is this sort of celebration of engineering, into the sculptures as well. So I wanted to make a piece that combined that kind of feeling of that 1930s representation of exuberance that was often done, I think is a riff off of really drapery, the classic drapery. So this is the piece here. This is some of the process of it, and it's going to be called Dressed Up and Pinned, as it is all dressed up, and it's going to be pinned right around this building right here. So it'll be a bench that people can hang out on, but also this real marker of space. Some of the substructure and some of the building here of the different parts and substructures that have to be pretty aggressive in order to survive that kind of use. I know the skateboarders are coming, right? So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what I've been up to while I've been gone. It's great to be back, and really, really an honor to be back here at Cranbrook, and the generosity of everybody's time that I've experienced this week, and to share some of my perspectives and see what everybody's up to here on campus. So thank you.